So, without further ado, I am thrilled, like truly thrilled, to introduce Mindy Seu. Mindy and I met in 2019, just before we had the pleasure of being colleagues at Rutgers University for several years. And when I first encountered her, I was totally wowed um, by many things, but I'll just focus on a few. Um, Mindy has this incredible ability to make it's truly magical to make the most radical ideas seem absolutely practical and completely accessible. From Mindy, I learned very quickly that no project is too big to be tackled one piece at a time, which means that it actually gives us all permission to allow our imaginations to be limitless. It's such an incredible sort of combination of vision and practice or praxis implementation that is truly extraordinarily intertwined in Mindy. In 2023, Mindy published a project she'd been working on for several years, the Cyberfeminism Index, an encyclopedic book that gathers 3 decades of online activism and net art. Cyberfeminism Index was commissioned by Rhizome, awarded a grant from the Graham Foundation, and underwent an international book tour with 89 performative readings across 18 countries, with sold out events at many, many institutions, the New Museum, Whitechapel, Amant Foundation, Lafayette Anticipations, and so many others. She is currently developing a new lecture performance called A Sexual History of the Internet, along with an artist book that will be published by Metalabel. Mindy has degrees from UCLA and Harvard and has taught at Yale, at Rutgers. And unfortunately, she's no longer with us because she is now an associate professor of design at UCLA, her alma mater. Very happy for her. And I'm so thrilled to welcome Mindy to the Artist Publishing Practicum today. Thank you so much, Mindy. And aren't you glad that I didn't say anything about about your clothes or all of the other amazing things that you offer? Mindy is amazing in every way.
Stephanie, thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction. I really appreciate that. We had so much fun working together at Rutgers. It was really heartbreaking to leave, but I have so much admiration for the faculty and artists there, and will always, of course, stay friends and colleagues. But today, as Stephanie mentioned, I'm going to be kind of talking about more of like a brass tacks overview of the Cyberfeminism Index and how it came to be through different micro projects that ultimately built into a whole. Also, then comparing different publishing styles and really thinking about why we might differ between online publishing, printed publishing, self publishing, and the like. So I'm going to share my screen. You should see a browser. So I'm in Berlin right now. The Wi-Fi in Germany is notoriously weak. So I was trying to upload all of this to my personal website just so you could have access to everything. I'm instead just going to plug this into the chat and you can find all of the references later on once I upload it, hopefully by the end of tonight, definitely sometime this week. But for now, I'm just running the file locally. So currently, you're looking at a PDF, a very quick GIF of every single page of the Cyberfeminism Index in the style of Muriel Cooper. And this manuscript essentially gives you kind of a peek of the project. It feels kind of like an encyclopedia of online activism and net art, compiling different entries, different indexes, different image styles, etc. The reason why I wanted to show things in the browser is because by nature, websites are very open access and open source. So all of my lecture notes you can see in this side panel here. This lecture as HTML comments was inspired by one given by Emma Ray Brummel at the School for Poetic Computation, and you can view Emma's lecture here. And I like to present in the browser because this is typically the environment in which you'll encounter my work. It's very internet focused. And as noted, websites are also generally open source and open access, so you'll be able to find all of my notes and citations here, even if I don't say them out loud. So when publishing, I always try to consider this trifecta of open access, open source, and crowdsourced, with the caveat that the crowdsourcing should include as many forms of attribution as possible. And I'll kind of walk through some examples of what that looks like. This is the cover of Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown. And my collaborator and very good friend Laura Combs noted that the byline reads, "Written and gathered by Adrienne Maree Brown." And I had never seen this byline before, but it really inspired this longer conversation and journey about what it means to be a gatherer rather than a writer, an editor, or something similar. I have long been a gatherer, and though we rarely hear this word used literally anymore, we do hear its sister, gathering. We're in a Zoom gathering today. But the term gatherer we more immediately associate with our origins as hunter-gatherers. We went, we gathered goods, and then we returned home to our kin, sharing as survival. So these were some of the opening lines of an essay I wrote for Salome Asega for Shift Space, which was the inaugural publication of the Knight Foundation. Before the tool that forces energy outward, we made the tool that brings energy home. Prior to the preeminence of sticks, swords, and the hero's killing tools, our ancestors' greatest invention was the container, the basket of wild oats, the net made of your own hair, the home, the place that contains whatever is sacred, the recipient, the holder, the story, the bag of stars. This was an excerpt by Ursula K. Le Guin, science fiction author extraordinaire, from A Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction from 1986. So in the past few years, this essay by Le Guin has been highly recirculated, and it begs the question why an essay written in the 80s feels so prescient today. And for me, it's because it expands our understanding of technology from the digital towards the analog ancestral technologies. And it also recenters our histories away from the individual hero and towards a collective, from a he to a we. So my personal gathering practice looks like this: some sort of material gathering, some sort of development of a container, and some sort of social gathering. So I gather people, resources, images, imaginings. These are then compiled into bespoke containers. My background is as a designer, so a container might be a book, an essay, a website, a performance, something like this. And then these are shared and grow during social gatherings. Some might call this practice resource sharing, info activism, redistribution, or the like. And all of these steps are quite messy, nonlinear, and communal. So they kind of feed back into each other and aren't actually in this very clear progression. And my containers are typically a technology-driven performance and publication, but we'll focus on the publishing part today. And I truly believe that building a relationship between disparate things is also a form of authorship for those who feel any anxiety about what it means to author something. So today I'm going to focus on the brass tacks of publishing, the Cyberfeminism Index and its various containers. I'll close with a new work that considers how we can publish community. One publishes to find comrades, a quote by Andre Breton. In 2017, I was a student at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society. This was the Internet Policy Org within the Harvard Law School. So here I found that my colleagues at the GSD and my colleagues at Berkman Klein had similar goals with approaches from opposite ends. So on one hand, you have artists focused on consciousness raising and social advocacy versus policymakers aiming for some larger legislative change. So I started compiling this medium agnostic spreadsheet that gathered some of these examples of online activism. Medium agnostic here is an important word that I'll touch back on a bit later. At this time, I was also very fascinated by the New Women's Survival Catalog, which was billed as the feminist Whole Earth Catalog. The Whole Earth Catalog is kind of the Bible of CEOs in Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs called it Google before Google. It's largely considered a proto-internet or like an early example of a search engine in printed form. And the New Women's Survival Catalog is a survey of alternative second wave feminism with Kirsten Grimstad and Susan Rennie from 1973. Meg Miller wrote an amazing overview of the New Women's Survival Catalog for AIG Ion Design, so you can find that link here. So compiled during a 5-month road trip across the United States, the New Women's Survival Catalog makes transparent the process of its own gathering in a very situated, subjective way. So Grimstad and Rennie got in a car, they drove across the US to California, and along the way stopped at race crisis centers. They talked to lawyers on how to get a divorce. They stopped at feminist bookstores and compiled all of these things in a very piecemeal way into one compendium. The catalog openly rallies together a community who see themselves as a new woman, for which the sharing of ideas is no less than a means of survival. So in the middle of the New Women's Survival Catalog, there's this section called Making the Book. And it talks about the primary people involved, the road trip, and all of the places that they visited. So my version of this road trip was the phone call. One of the first people that I spoke with was Judy Malloy, who was an early media artist and e-lit author, and she introduced the terms yak and hack as shorthand for theory. So yak, like yak, talking, and hack, like hacking and making, and how entangled these two things really are. So the spreadsheet started to look something like this. This is the real embed of the spreadsheet. It is an iframe. I don't know why it's not scrolling right now, but oh, here it is, great. But you can see that even if you don't look at the title, date, and authors, if you just scroll through the center, which it's not letting me right now, but things don't fit very cleanly into individual categories. You see things that are kind of tacked across a lot of different categories. And it really brought to light a lot of the problems with these very systematized systems that basically foreground a structure before it's the things within the container. And I'll unpack that a bit more. So this is the first GUI-based spreadsheet. GUI is graphical user interface. This came out in 1985. This is actually version 1.5. The first digital spreadsheet actually came out in the 70s on Linux, but the visual one I think is quite important because when they first appeared, spreadsheets were considered, quote, functional programming for the masses. They were liberatory technologies. And if you had access to this and a personal computer, you could start to do fairly complex computations online. However, conventional data structures, especially tables and arrays, are confined structures created from a rigid top-down specification that enforces regularity and rectangularity. So this rectangularity that Ted Nelson discusses is basically if you create a two-dimensional system where it really accommodates the norm, but it breaks when there's any sort of variable. And this breakage is typically called a vulnerability. You hear this word a lot also when we're talking about AI systems that break when certain things don't fit into the system. So he proposed creating tools that had an expansive system that actually accommodated these interstices rather than focusing on the norms themselves. This spreadsheet was really not working for us, so instead we created our own. I put that spreadsheet online. It started off as a bibliography for myself, and it kind of went mini viral. And during this this first release, I was just asking for edits and entries for myself, and it kind of snowballed from there. So we found that crowdsourcing through this open access spreadsheet was really bumpy. So I then talked to Michael Connor at Rhizome, who gave us a grant to basically create an online database to create, again, a system that could accommodate as many variables and encourage as many variables as possible. So some inspo for the website. What you're looking at here is a page from the Talmud. The Talmud is the central religious and theological text for Judaism. And here you can see the color coding. So the center column is called the Mishnah. The columns flanking this are scholars talking about the Mishnah, and the outermost column is commentaries on the commentary. So built into the structure of the page, you have a dialectic of different voices. And a primary question for my collaborators and designers and I were, how do we show that you're looking at a lot of different people on the page? Here you also see Ted Nelson. Ted Nelson is the inventor of the concept of hypertext, and he refers to the Talmud as a core inspiration for hypertext and hyperlinks today. It's also very related to this idea of encyclopedias and bibliographies as early examples of hypertext, because again, it shows that reading is inherently nonlinear. We're bringing together a lot of different voices and references, and we're trying to show how the connections exist. So these hyperlinks existed long before digital links that we know today. This is an excerpt from the Whole Earth Millennium Catalog, and in it you'll see this reference to a cat jumping in a hole. So we're on page 70. If you want to see a related topic, you could jump to page 90. So this cross-reference is a very clear analog example of a hyperlink. And then in the introduction of Cyberfeminism, Connectivity, Critique, and Creativity by Renata Klein and Susan Hawthorne, they actually describe their cross-reference, this eye icon, as a hypertextual link. So throughout this essay anthology, whenever you saw that eye icon in the margins, you knew that you could jump to a different part of the book. And another example of how we can basically show these interconnections was an expansion of Ted Nelson's idea of visible connections using Xanadu, which was his proto-internet, which was a precursor to the World Wide Web. So there are some similarities between this and the World Wide Web that we use. We still see like a long scrolling page in the center. But what's unique about this is anytime I have a link, that actually pulls up the original source document and shows the context of that link within the larger thread. So all these different pages show the family of links and references that came to building this one here. This is also showing an example of a two-way link, which showed that the architecture of this proto-internet focused on an archival practice. And that is not the way the World Wide Web works. So we're currently using one-way links, which means if I link to this page at Lewis Place, and at Lewis Place goes down or even moves the page to a different part of the site, the link on my page would lead to a 404, which is called link rot or bit rot. So when Angeline Meitzler and I were trying to figure out what this database should look like, our primary questions were, how do websites age? How do you show citations? And how do we really think about the posterity of these very ephemeral platforms? So when you first arrive at the site, this green blur sharpens to reveal a fairly standard table. But upon interaction, that table is made to feel unusual. As you're clicking, you'll see that your selections are added to the side panel, which we call the learning trail. So whether you're clicking intuitively or intentionally, you can begin to build associations between your selections. And this idea of the learning trail is something that Charles Bryskowski, who is one of the co-founders of Arena, has written a lot about as a form of knowledge production. So you can see that on the Arena blog. And to basically show how these sections are interconnected, each of the entries always has an internal link, a cross-reference, or a jump link, a lot of different names, that push and pull you to different parts of the site. My video bar is kind of hiding this, but you'll see at the bottom that there's two buttons here. You have a download button and a view all downloads. So the download button basically allows you to download all of this as a PDF or a reader that looks like this. Paul Soalis writes for Rhizome that downloading is a political act, especially in a time when we don't own any of our content anymore. We host everything on a cloud. We view everything on a streaming service. We're not downloading our music. So when these sites go down, you basically lose access to the source. And digital archivists will tell you that duplication is a form of preservation. And it also allows for these clones to disseminate in offline or on non-mainstream channels. An essay is a public, and then a publication is the site where a public is formed. So that first quote, an essay as a public, is a quote by Dr. Tressie McMillan Cotton. And in their newsletter, Essaying, she wrote, "Beneath all the prose and argument, an essay is a public. The best essays build a public through process and form, driven from creative impulse to address a social problem. The best scholarship and the most invigorated publics have this in common. They channel massive amounts of creativity into relationships, into methods, into networks, and into discourse." And I first discovered this quote in the introduction of Year of the Tiger by disability activist and artist Alice Wong. So the second quote is it's not verbatim. It's a reformulation of an idea from Publics and Counterpublics by queer theorist Michael Warner. So here he suggests that a publication is the site where a public is formed. So to me, it builds on Cotton's idea that an essay is a representation of a public. It's a reconfiguring of a social dialogue. And for Warner, publishing is then a call and response for discourse. So maybe the second online publication of Cyberfeminism Index was the database. The first was the spreadsheet. So why make it a book? And there are several reasons, but the most important are probably in regards to posterity and citations. So according to Forbes, the average lifespan of a website is 2 years and 7 months. So by that regard, this website would be long gone by now. Printing this also in the official way, quote unquote, with an ISBN, also allowed it to be inserted into a forever institution like the Library of Congress. And because a lot of the content of the Cyberfeminism Index is very grassroots, while I did think the primary circulation should actually continue to exist in those channels, which is why we amplified this downloading function, it was also a way to kind of infiltrate an institution with a lot of radical discourse that maybe might not live there otherwise, and also then use their resources as a form of posterity. Maxwell Neely Cohen recently published a collection of essays for Harvard's Library Innovation Lab called Century Scale Storage. And in it, he writes about print and books. He says, "Print books in a physical codex form naturally decentralized to an extreme degree. They find their way into not only institutions, but the collections of individuals. They are like plants whose seeds have adapted to float and spread in the wind, engineered to end up exactly where you would least suspect and persist. Even small, self-published print runs of artist zines can end up in the Museum of Modern Art or the National Archives. And unlike digital storage, the survival of print requires physical libraries, even if those libraries are shelved in an individual's home. So a second reason that I chose to print the online database was for the purpose of citations. There are several modes of citational praxis, including community citations, such as oral histories, social citations, which is a new term for retweets or screenshots on social media that give credit to the original source, fiscal citations, which is kind of a new idea that I'll unpack at the very end, and academic citations. And perhaps academic citations is how we typically connote what citations actually includes. It really feels formal. It feels like it's based on a pre-existing structure like MLA, and it feels kind of exclusionary. It doesn't really feel like a practice for everyday life. Search engines like Google were also modeled after academic citations. They would basically weight links depending on the quote-unquote authority of the author and who was considered more legitimizing than others, and also the frequency of clicks, so quantity and authority. Some academic journals also weight by media, so books and print, in some forms, they see as more legitimizing than ephemeral media, like spoken word, websites, things of this nature. And then sites like Wikipedia only accept secondary sources. So a secondary source is basically me writing about something else versus me writing about myself. So writing about yourself, a primary source, is considered delegitimate. So all to say, publishing a book was one large citational hack, because with this book, we were able to create 600 plus secondary sources in print in a formal book with an ISBN for hundreds of works that have never been cited before. And because of this, there's also been like various hackathons where we just try to push as much content in Cyberfeminism Index onto Wikipedia, because now we have secondary sources. So while books might seem more legitimizing, here the hard copy is actually serving as a snapshot of the moment of the website's mutation when it was frozen in 2020. But the website will actually continue on as a living index, and it will grow in perpetuity. So during the book tour, as I would talk about this book and its contents and encourage people to submit, there was increasingly discrepancy between the book, a snapshot, and the living index, the website. I think now the book has 600 or so entries and the online website has like 900 or something. So you can see that it's constantly cultivating things, and I want that to grow in perpetuity. So I also want to talk a bit about how we decided to shape the book in its, I consider it a very material exercise. So I want to just talk quickly about some references. So while many of our material references, when I say our in this case, I'm talking about Laura Combs, who was a good friend and designer and collaborator for the website. It was with Janine Rosen and Angeline Meitzler. But for the book, we wanted to look at a lot of references for books that have translated the digital into analog, like this book by Rhizome, The Art Happens Here. We also wanted to look at textural references. So what are paper qualities that make it feel non-precious and like a resource book? And those are things like McMaster-Carr, encyclopedias, phone books. They feel thin, they feel floppy. They don't feel like this precious thing that you just set on a coffee table. A seminal contextual resource was Lucy Lepard's 6 Years. So here, She gathered reviews, articles, and other texts about the dematerialization of art and sequenced them in chronological order and within each year in alphabetical order. So it really does start to feel like this very structured chronological feed, even if it was publishing all of these works during the 60s and early 70s. And you kind of get this feed scrolling sense through the Cyberfeminism Index as well. So as my collaborator, as Laura and I were trying to figure out what the bounds of an anthology might look like, but also really determined what kind of publisher we should use. So I talked to several publishers, but the three primary ones were MIT Press, Phaidon, and Inventory Press. So MIT Press is a very established academic press. And with establishments like these, it's, in one hand, extremely legitimizing. It also suggests a certain audience. And they also then have a practice of peer review. So you basically are assigned an editor and you work with them for 3 years. This was the time frame that they suggested to basically sequence something like this. And because they're a pre-existing press who they commission different people for covers, but not really for the interior design, they weren't quite convinced as to why we needed more autonomy over what the book materiality was like. So while it was a consideration, I felt like the book's form was as important as its content, so I wanted to look for a publisher that would accommodate this a bit more. Phaidon is a very well-known art book publisher. It's typically associated with compendiums and monoliths and things like this. Phaidon was interested in publishing more of like a beautiful art object, the kinds that would be $70 or so, and it feels like this precious object. But for me, while it was important to have a printed version of this, it was equally important to make it as economical and democratic as possible. So even things down to the paper size that we used was so we can fit as many pieces of paper on a single broadsheet. We chose specific inks, black and white, except for one spot color, to make it as cheap as possible. So the idea of trying to make this an $80 beautiful object did not feel like it celebrated the ethos of what this was after, which was really meant to be a resource guide that could fall apart, be dog-eared, be underlined, and I wanted people to kind of break down and use this book. So I then went to Inventory Press, which is the press underneath the design studio Infoco, Inventory Form and Content. And they publish a lot of artist and architecture books. So not only do they give you editorial support, but they also really understand the material implications. Typically with the press like this, it still requires that the artist come to the table with some sort of funding package, whether through your school, whether through grant writing, things of this nature. The press will also then offer a lot of support for production. So they typically have a series of printers that they like working with. They will give you design support because Infoco is a design studio. And they will also then give you all of the brass tacks support once you have the book. What that means is if you work with the legitimate quote unquote press, then you're able to get certain grants like the Graham Foundation grant. Graham does not work with individuals. They only work with people who have presses. And same with DAP, which is one of the largest international distributors. DAP does not work with individuals. You have to be part of it or be under a press. So with Inventory Press, we're able to work with DAP. DAP then has warehouses all over Europe, Asia, and the US that holds on to your book, reaches out to all the bookstores, and then ships books within each zone to reduce shipping costs. So for me, Inventory Press kind of felt like the trifecta of different things that I wanted at the time. And self-publishing, I still think is a very viable model, which I'll be talking more at the very end of this. though maybe quickly because just looking at the time. Okay, so let me just show you how we made the book. So what you see here is again, we froze the website in 2020. Maybe 2021. We imported it into Google Docs. And then my editor, Andrew Scheinman, and I edited it for months in Google Docs, including a color coding system. So our titles are red, our metadata is green, excerpts are normal, cross-references and links are gray, and annotations are blue. So then we basically Laura and I worked with the programmer Lily Healy, who programs every issue of The New Yorker. So here you can see Lily's screen. She is downloading our Google Doc as an XML file, which is a markup file. She is opening up an InDesign file. And this InDesign file appears blank, but it comes pre-tagged with Laura's paragraph styles, character styles, grids, guides, fonts, etc. So when Lily drags in the XML, it appears to magically populate around 400 pages of this book in a matter of seconds. So this scripting process was really helpful for us because most of the book is so templated, and because there were so many different components of this, so we just needed a strategic way of systematizing the design. And yet, it still requires so much editing and designing and typesetting in layout. So I think it goes to show that even if you create these seemingly efficient technological systems, it definitely always requires a lot of human labor, a human hand. This is the image version of that, but I'm gonna not do this right now just for the sake of time. So this is what we ended up with. Because the book form is so unusual as this sort of encyclopedia, we also had to figure out how to demonstrate it during these readings. So I worked with Tommy Martinez, who's a creative technologist, and we figured out this AR application, augmented reality, where this is an image spread. We pulled out 500 by 500 pixel areas of that image. And then here you can see an excerpt from our launch at the New Museum. This table here, you can see the book. This black thing is an overhead camera, and that camera is constantly scanning. So as the camera sees one of those targets, it would overlay that section with its respective video. So it feels rather glitchy, but for me that was important so people could understand that the video was stitched to the book rather than just overlaying on the screen. So then during this book tour, this is our embedded website, tour.cyberfeminismindex.com. You'll see that for every single event, I wanted to make sure that it was alongside people who were in this book or other artists, activists, or scholars who have really worked on mutating this very ever-mutating space of cyberfeminism. So with Lee Blalock in Chicago, this is Laura, the book's designer. With Cornelia Solfrank, who's one of the first cyberfeminists, etc. So this goes on and on. I truly believe that publishing is an experiment, and while there are very clear models, these are also suggested opportunities for breakage, and this tool breaking is really fundamental to my practice. So even things like HTML comments as lectures, using JavaScript to templatize a book, using Unity to publish as a publishing tool and the like. All of these are different avenues for maybe using a convention, but figuring out how to make use of that media that's specific to your project. And publishing ultimately is the beginning of a social work. That's that Michael Warner idea of the call and response. So you publish something and it forms a public and a dialogue that you can continue on in perpetuity. I know we're at time. I might just say one thing about this upcoming project. I was going to share a video, but I don't think we have time to view it, so I'll just put it in the chat. So I have a new project, lecture, performance, and book coming out called The Sexual History of the Internet. In this case, the performance is accompanied by an artist book that we are choosing to self-publish. So Metalabel is a platform that will sell the book, but it's not a publisher. So what does self-publishing mean versus what we did here? Self-publishing means that we have to do everything ourselves, from editing, design, lithography, production tests, distribution, reaching out to bookstores, all of that. But why are we doing all of that if we could just publish it with the real press? Metalabel is interesting because it's co-founded by Yancey Strickler, who's the former CEO of Kickstarter. And because it's a startup, he basically said that I could build in whatever function that I wanted to test out. And he already has an easy split mechanism where you can easily allocate funds to different people. So on Metalabel, the platform, Metalabel, would get 10%, and that 90%, the artist can choose what to do with it. So they can keep 90% for themselves, or they can distribute it equally amongst all the people who helped make the book. What I chose to do is create this idea of pools, 30% for the team, 30% for image permissions, and 30% for citations. So I want to test out this new model for attribution where every single person cited in the book, there's around 30 to 40, would split 30% of all profits, and you could basically pay out immediately through Stripe. So this citational split is what we're testing out, and I think it could be a novel way to just think about a new model for attribution. So yes, you get a lot of the social citation that we've talked about earlier, but it might also accompany this with the fiscal citation, especially if people, again, it's an artist book. We're only printing around 2,000 to 3,000, but if we then sell out, each person cited would make around $500. So I think it's an interesting experiment to figure out what this new fiscal model could look like. With that, I'm going to turn it over back to the At Lewis Place theme. I'm going to stop sharing, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Mindy. Thank you so much. Folks, we've got a couple of questions that we already have in the queue that I'm going to share, but there might be time for one or two more. So if you still have a couple questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll see what we can do. The first question is from Chinging, and it says, how do you consider safety of yourself, loved ones, and other community members if part of your public communities, engagers that you activate from your work include members who are hostile to our ideas, identities, communities, and respond as such to your work in a public way?
I'm going to approach this question from a tactical angle that I've been considering. It's a bit on the skirts of that question, but so initially when I was thinking about this citational split thing, I thought it's not actually an idea that scales, right? Because it could so easily be abused. In this case, I know who my team is, I know who I'm trying to pay out, so it's a small microcosm of what a structure of fiscal attribution might look like. But if this became a plugin that lived on top of Google, it would so easily abused. Do we want someone like Joe Rogan to get a micropayment for every single time they're cited. Probably not. But then it made me think, was talking about this with some other friends, and my lawyer friend, Alexander Arnold, said, you don't actually have to create a system that scales for everyone. You can be very intentional about who is welcome in that space or not. And this is where value alignment and content moderation comes in, especially when you're thinking about like platform politics. So you can still choose to make a certain structure that will be accessible to as many people as possible if they explicitly follow the values and are value aligned with the people in your community. So it's kind of like a high level way of trying to create a mutable safety structure. But I hope that gives maybe a concrete way to think about that question. But thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. The next question is from Thomas. Thomas asks, do you think there is a cognitive difference between digital publishing and publishing on the page?
Yes, there's been many studies about this. So typically when you read online, they do like eye mapping tests where you your eyes will gravitate towards the top left of the screen and then scan for the first few lines and then focus primarily on the left-hand column or left-hand side of the column as you scroll down. So you're basically encouraging skimming. This is also, it's no surprise, that's Google made money through clicks, so they wanted you to click and surf as quickly as possible. And then this was then made into an economic system that encourage that kind of behavior. For books, there's other physical cues. They find that people are able to have a system of recall depending on the location of the page and the foredge. So you can remember if it was top right, left, or top, bottom, left, or right, but also where it might have existed on the side of the page. So whether that leads to like larger retention, I'm not quite sure, but it does certainly change the way you're reading the page, which causes certain behavioral shifts. So I'm still the kind of person that prints something out to read it. So I prefer reading paper, even though I basically live online.
So I'm just looking, there's another question from Dan. It says, thank you so much for this, Mindy. Maybe off topic or too much to address here, but do you have thoughts on the pipeline of bright, tech-curious STEM kids being increasingly funneled into leveraging their skills for big tech and governments? How do we, I assume the royal we, encourage them otherwise? Where do we steer them? Asking, especially as a paraeducator who's always disheartened to see how politically agnostic, optimization focused my STEM kids are.
Yeah, I wonder about this too, because we hear STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. We hear STEAM, so the addition of art in there. I think part of this is an educational question of why STEM students are not then encouraged to focus on a social and historical framing of the technical skills that they're learning. So I truly believe that learning about medicine, you should learn about the history of medicine. If you're learning about engineering, you should learn about the history of engineering. If you're learning about creative computation, it goes the same way. So I think that a social situatedness is really valuable and also leads to some sort of like consciousness raising that implicates why these technical tools are embedded within a holistic thing. So this optimization focused thing, this is why I think that STEAM is actually an interesting model. When I have friends that basically try to make these tech terms feel a bit clunky, like useless software, coined by David Reinfurt, or poetic computation by the SFPC team and Tae-Yoon Choi. Yeowon Song uses anti-user friendly, anti-user friendly UX. So I think this kind of thing, even if the root word has a connotation of efficiency, of productivity, of commerce, by adding these different adjectives, it troubles what that means and suggests that it could be used for other means. So I wonder if this and the historical situating might be a strategy, but I don't know how you actually change that within these larger departments. But I do know this is actively being pursued in many art departments. So it's just, again, that question of merging humanities and sciences. Maybe not a great answer, or like there's no clear models for this. But thank you.
So Stephanie asks, curious if you can speak further to the financial aspects of your choice to work with inventory versus MIT versus Faden, as well as your book tour. What advice do you have for artists who don't have a lot of funding up front?
That's a great question. So I think what was a little tricky about, I'll focus primarily on inventory press here. So because my background's in design, I worked with a designer. I brought in my own editor. Laura brought in our own lithographer. We actually didn't necessarily need a lot of the design and editorial support that's typically offered by a press as an alternative to a larger percentage. So, percentage of profits. A press doesn't have that much additional funds either. So may not be able to pay you an upfront cost, but they can say, we can subsidize this by platforming you, giving you editorial support, giving you design support. Ultimately, we kind of handed over the manuscript and design files with like a bow on top. Like it was edited, all the images went through a lithographer, etc. But I still got the same kind of cut breakdown that was really hard to push against. That cut breakdown is typically around 10%, and that 90% goes to various forms of press, various forms of publicity, of storage, of all of this. But you can see that cut, 90 to 10, is really difficult, especially if publishing industry at large makes no money, but for books that are only selling 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, it's not that much money at all. So what advice do I have for artists who don't have a lot of funding up front? I think that if you're able to work with much, much, much smaller presses, that actually might be a strategy because no one's getting paid up front, but that also means you don't have to come to the table with a funding package. So you can work together with the designer and the editors to build something. They often offer editorial support, so you're able to publish something alongside them. And then they also then help with distribution, even if it's a much smaller quantity of a first print run, maybe in the hundreds, because they're self-printing rather than something like that. You can also work with an agent who will try to get you the best package possible. So this is more for like an essay anthology route. So currently I'm working with an agent to publish something not confirmed with semiotext. And this is a much different model, right? Like they don't have so much interest in the material form. They want an essay anthology. And you still get a similar percentage or cut, but an agent will basically do all of that haggling for you. But this can also get tricky because maybe their primary incentive is to sell as many things as possible and to make it as public as possible, even if maybe you want it to be with for a specific audience or community. So I do think that alternative models of self-publishing and distribution, which is why I'm doing this Metalabel version, is something that I think can be viable and promising. And I'm curious myself to figure out how that works. So once this Metalabel thing goes through, then I'll write a big thing about it, and hopefully we can weigh the pros and cons of self-publishing versus not.
That's incredible. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
We are all so grateful for you for spending this time with us. Thank you again for your questions. Thank you for just really opening at least my eyes to the possibilities of um, kind of, I don't know, I feel like my sense of where and how to think about citation and net art was sort of like dated to the last time I was in school. So this is just really inspiring and exciting to see. And thank you for being so open with your materials. It's wonderful to see. So yeah, we're going to transition now to our next speaker. Mindy, you are, of course, very welcome to stay with us for as long as you'd like. And yeah, thanks so much.